Let me tell you something about myself. I'm Mary, a retired forensic accountant, widow of 15 years, and mother to one son who means the world to me. For most of my life, I worked with numbers, patterns, and the quiet satisfaction of uncovering what others wanted to hide. These days, I spend my time gardening, reading historical novels, and occasionally sipping wine on my porch, quiet pleasures earned from decades of keeping everything running, while others took credit. But nothing in my calm, post-retirement life prepared me for the performance I had to give at my son's wedding. David had found love, or what he thought was love, with a woman named Lauren Whitmore. Blonde, polished, impossibly poised, Lauren came from old money and made sure everyone knew it. From the very first time we met, she looked through me like I was a minor detail in the background of her curated life. The wedding, of course, had to be held at the most exclusive vineyard estate in Northern California. The guest list ballooned to over 300, only 20 of whom were actually from our side. Everything about that day was designed to dazzle. Imported orchids, a 6-tier cake flown in from Paris, a string quartet hired from New York. And then there was the dress. Not Lauren's. Mine. A $50,000 rental gown she insisted I wear. Her exact words were, "You simply must look elevated, Mary. After all, you'll be standing next to my mother." I didn't want the dress. I didn't want to stand next to anyone. But I smiled and wore it, because that's what mothers do when their children get married. I told myself, this wasn't my day. I held my breath, smoothed the hand-embroidered silk, and told myself it would all be over soon. And then came the moment that changed everything. We were at the reception, and I was talking with one of David's old teachers, retelling a sweet memory from 2nd grade. I raised my glass of water to my lips, and a single drop slid down the side, falling unfortunately onto the hem of Lauren's gown. I immediately bent to dab it with my napkin, apologizing for what was barely even visible. That's when I caught the look in her eyes. Sharp, cold, and calculating. She stepped back dramatically. Her full glass of red wine tilted and poured down the entire front of my gown. It didn't dribble, it cascaded. Rich, crimson, soaking through silk and beading like a stain that would never come out. She gasped, covering her mouth in fake horror. "So sorry, Mary. I get jumpy when I'm startled." The room fell silent. Hundreds of faces turned toward me. I looked at my son, then back at his bride, and I smiled. Not because I found it funny, not because I forgave her. I smiled because, in that exact moment, I decided on something that would change all of our lives. I leaned in just enough for her to hear me clearly, and said it as calmly as I ever said anything in my entire career. "You just made the biggest mistake of your privileged life." 3 days after the wedding, the invoice arrived. It came by email, bold and unapologetic, with a subject line that read, "Final charges for damaged rental." I opened it over my morning coffee and stared at the number at the bottom like it might blink away if I looked long enough. $57,000. That was the cost of one woman's pride, soaked in red wine and sewn into silence. I didn't forward it. I didn't call David. I simply clicked the payment button, entered my information, and closed the tab. Some people scream when they're humiliated. Some cry or call a lawyer. I cleaned my cup, rinsed the sink, and went upstairs. My office hadn't been touched in years. It still smelled faintly of printer ink and jasmine, the candle I used to light on long audit nights. I sat down at the desk I once used to unravel multi-million-dollar frauds and opened my old laptop. I didn't need revenge. I needed clarity. I needed to understand what kind of family thought that humiliation was an acceptable way to welcome someone into their fold. I pulled out my black notebook, the one with every professional contact I'd ever trusted. Names, extensions, passwords to private databases no one talks about outside of boardrooms and subpoenas. I wasn't angry, not exactly. Anger is loud, and what I felt was quiet, cold, precise. The kind of emotion that doesn't fade with time, but sharpens into focus. That night, I poured a single glass of white wine and reopened the tools I thought I'd left behind forever. Lauren Whitmore thought she'd taught me a lesson. She thought she could buy me off with a gown and drown me in silence with a single spill. But what she did was wake something up. Something she and her perfect family would soon learn had far more value than any dress ever could. The first thing I did was look for what they thought no one would bother checking. Corporate records, public filings, anything filed with the SEC. Most people assume those documents are too boring to hide anything, but that's only if you don't know where to look. Ashford Global Holdings, the company behind Lauren's family wealth, had a pristine surface, clean annual reports, steady growth, and a list of subsidiaries that looked impressive, if not overly expansive. But there was something about the structure that felt off. Too many layers, too many middlemen for a business supposedly built on efficiency. I ran their logistics branch through a database used by forensic auditors. Shipping routes didn't match reported inventory. Vessels were docked in Charleston, offloading cargo labeled as luxury furniture, but the invoices told a different story. I found a dozen mismatches in a single afternoon. One shell company kept appearing on their payment records. It was registered in Delaware, existed on paper only, and somehow received over $3 million in consulting fees last fiscal year. Another name popped up, tied to real estate deals in the Cayman Islands, linked to a P.O. box and no physical office. This wasn't sloppy. It was intentional. The deeper I went, the more obvious it became. Money was being moved around, rerouted through layers of companies that didn't do anything but exist on paper. The math didn't lie. Income vanished between transactions. Expenses were duplicated across entities. That's when the theory started to form. They weren't just hiding income. They were hiding operations. This wasn't tax evasion by accident. This was laundering, disguised in contracts and smoothed over by legal jargon. And whoever built it thought they were too smart to get caught. I smiled because they hadn't planned for me. The reservation was under his name, of course. Richard Ashford was already seated when I arrived, tucked into a corner booth at an upscale steakhouse with white linen tablecloths and waiters who called you ma'am, no matter how old you were. He stood with a practiced smile, extended his hand like we were equals, and motioned for the sommelier before I even sat down. He'd ordered the wine already. Something aged, something French, something that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. I asked for water. He didn't flinch, but I caught the pause in his eyes, like he was already recalculating. He began with pleasantries, flattery about my background, compliments on how proud David was to have me as a mother. Then he pivoted. There was a project, he said, a consulting role, nothing too demanding. Just some extra eyes on internal processes as they expanded into new international markets. He didn't say what kind of eyes he needed, but I understood. This wasn't a job offer, it was a muzzle. Dress it in contracts and title it however you want. It was still an attempt to pull me in and shut me up. I stirred my water slowly and smiled. I told him I appreciated the opportunity and would love to see the materials. He relaxed, probably thought I'd taken the bait. But what he didn't realize was that I had no intention of becoming a consultant. I was already something far more dangerous. I was the problem he thought he could manage, sitting calmly across the table, taking notes. 3 days later, a leather-bound courier folder arrived at my door. Inside were the contracts, a welcome letter, and several thick stacks of financial reports, printed on crisp paper. 6 subsidiaries, 3 years of data, and a neatly typed cover sheet labeled Preliminary Materials for Review. They thought they were giving me a leash. What they handed over was a weapon. The documents gave me legal access to their books, under the scope of consulting review, complete with clauses that excluded any obligation to conceal unlawful activity. I spent the next 2 days cataloging every line item, highlighting transaction trails, and cross-referencing entities that had no business dealing with each other. They assumed I would be overwhelmed, but for someone who'd spent 3 decades digging through corporate deceit, this was familiar ground. There were shell companies disguised as importers, vendors that didn't exist, and service fees that tripled overnight without explanation. The money moved in patterns, forming loops instead of straight lines. That's how you hide something. You don't bury it. You make it go in circles until no one can follow. But I could follow. Because what Richard didn't know when he offered me this role was that I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I was looking for proof. And now, thanks to their own arrogance, they had given me everything I needed to bring them down from the inside. David showed up at my house, looking like he hadn't slept. His tie was crooked, his eyes red-rimmed, and his voice tight when he asked what was going on. He said Vanessa was upset, that her father was worried, and that he just wanted everyone to move past the wedding incident. I told him we couldn't move past what hadn't even begun to surface. Then I handed him the files. 3 registered nonprofits, all led by Vanessa. All are receiving millions in donations. None with any real programs, staff, or operations, just names. Empty shells with beautiful websites and no beneficiaries. He flipped through the documents slowly. At first, he looked confused, then defensive, then quiet. He asked if maybe there was an explanation. Maybe she didn't know what her father was doing. Maybe it was just sloppy accounting. I didn't raise my voice. I just pointed to a transfer of $2 million sent from the Caribbean Development Initiative to a bank in Grand Cayman, a trust in Vanessa's name. He stared at it, then at me. I saw something in him start to crack. I told him the truth without apology, that his wife wasn't just someone who lied. She was someone who built entire structures out of lies. He wanted to argue, but the evidence was in his hands. All I said was this: I know you love her, but you deserve to love someone who isn't building their life on your blindness. He came back the next day, no longer asking questions but carrying them in his eyes. David sat at my kitchen table like he used to when he scraped his knees, looking for comfort but knowing he needed more than that. He said he'd been up all night rereading the documents, checking every account, every name, every wire transfer. He asked what it would mean if he came forward. What would it cost? I told him it might cost him everything, but losing yourself costs more. Then I looked him straight in the eye and said something I knew he needed to hear. Being a man isn't about protecting someone because you love them. It's about choosing what's right, even when it breaks your heart. There was a long silence before he nodded. Not fast, not dramatic. Just the kind of nod a person gives when they've finally made peace with a truth they didn't want. That afternoon, he called a friend from college who now worked for the FBI and said 6 words that shifted the ground beneath us. I have something you'll want to see. Watching him take that first step didn't erase the pain, but it reminded me that integrity runs deeper than blood. He wasn't doing this for me. He was doing it because he finally saw who he was and who he refused to become. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not from the air conditioning, but from the weight of silence that filled every corner. Rows of polished wood benches, the quiet rustle of papers, and the eyes of strangers waiting to see if the elegant woman in the witness chair had anything worth saying. I sat straight, hands folded in my lap, and answered each question with precision. I laid out the shell companies, the false invoices, the wire transfers that looped through nonprofit accounts like they were washing machines. Every name, every number, every detail was documented and clear. Vanessa didn't look at me once. She sat with her chin lifted, eyes fixed on the far wall like none of this mattered. Richard Ashford, seated beside her, showed no emotion at all. But when the prosecution displayed the email she sent to the fake vendor she'd created under her maiden name, something shifted. Her posture tightened. Her fingers twitched. Her mask cracked. The attorney asked her if she recognized the email. She turned to her father, lips parted, eyes wide. Then, snapped. She shouted that it wasn't supposed to be found, that she only did it because he told her to. The room went still. Her lawyer tried to hush her, but it was too late. In 3 sentences, she buried her own defense. The jury didn't need more. The judge called a recess. Reporters raced outside. David sat 2 rows back, frozen. He didn't look proud. He looked broken. As for me, I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I just sat there and waited to be dismissed. Not because I needed a victory, but because truth, when finally spoken out loud, doesn't need applause. It just needs to land. And it did. The verdict came in just after noon on a Wednesday. Guilty on all counts. The judge's voice was steady, but the weight of those words filled the room like a final stone placed on a grave that had been dug long ago. That evening, David asked if he could take me to dinner. I let him choose the place. When I walked in and realized it was the same restaurant where Richard had once tried to buy my silence, I nearly turned back. But David pulled out my chair and said he thought it was time we reclaimed the place. Saturday. We didn't talk about the trial. We didn't talk about Vanessa. We just ordered the sea base, split a bottle of wine, and let the quiet do what it needed to. Halfway through the meal, he looked at me and said he didn't know how I stayed calm through everything. I told him calm isn't the absence of fury. It's what happens when you know exactly what your purpose is. He nodded, then reached across the table, eyes damp but steady. He said he used to think strength looked like control. Now he knew it looked like the truth. I smiled, not because I was proud of him, but because he'd finally found his own way to be proud of himself. As we left, he held the door open for me, like he did when he was a boy trying to impress me after getting in trouble. And just before we stepped into the night, he said one more thing. I should have listened to you sooner. I said back, it's not when you listen that matters. It's that you finally do. The dress still hangs in my closet, stained, ruined, but never cleaned. I kept it not as a reminder of humiliation, but as proof of what came after. That wine-red silk became the start of something far greater than what anyone in that vineyard could have imagined. Sometimes, strength shows up in the most unexpected ways. Not in raised voices or dramatic exits, but in the steady hand that pays the bill, opens the laptop, and starts pulling threads until the whole web unravels. I used to think being underestimated was a disadvantage. Now, I know it's a weapon if you know how to wield it. The truth is, I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking recognition. Not from society, or even my family, from myself. I needed to remember who I was before I became someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's easy target. And I did. I found her again, sitting in the back of a courtroom, typing late at night, holding a glass of wine and choosing not to throw it. For every woman who's been dismissed because of her age, her calm, her silence, let this be your reminder. Still, waters don't mean there's nothing beneath. Sometimes they hide a storm, and sometimes they hide a plan. If you've ever had your moment like that dress, something meant to shame you, I hope you turned it into your own banner too. We're not done after 50. We're just quieter, smarter, and far more dangerous to those who mistake us for fragile. That red stain never came out, and I hope it never does. Because every time I see it, I don't see a spill. I see a flag. One that says, "You picked the wrong woman."